My grandmother twice put greedy pastors in their place, even after her death. My grandmother was a member of a large conservative Christian church her entire adult life. This church, which I'll call Big White Church, was part of a major evangelical denomination. Big White Church was located in a prosperous suburb of a large city in the southern United States. My grandmother was a very active member of Big White Church. Every Sunday morning, she worked in the church's nursery, helped prepare hundreds of breakfasts and dinners for the congregation, accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church trips and choir tours. On Sunday evenings, she led a youth Bible study group, actively participated in missionary work, and assisted with other youth programs. She always gave her tithe and often donated extra for missions and special collections. My grandmother had a gift. She knew how to make others feel important. I saw this many times myself, even though I attended a different church. I often visited my grandmother and would attend Big White Church events with her. I saw her single-handedly prepare breakfast for dozens of church teens. Imagine a task that took over 2 hours, even in the church's huge kitchen. And after the meal, she'd ask everyone to applaud the high school student who helped organize the prayer breakfast. He did such a great job. I remember during one youth trip to a church camp, my grandmother drove nearly all night back to the city to pick up a box of evangelistic materials that one of the pastor's assistants, let's call him the assistant, had forgotten. He asked my grandmother to bring them for the morning session. His boss, the senior pastor, never found out that the assistant had messed up, and my grandmother fixed everything. The assistant didn't even thank her. Though I was just a kid, it really upset me, and I asked my grandmother why she agreed to do it. She said it didn't bother her, and her reward would be that those materials would help the kids find Jesus. My grandmother's work at the church came to an abrupt end at 73 when she injured her spine in a car accident. For the last 10 years of her life, she was confined to her home, unable to attend church due to this injury and her declining health with age. Her mind remained sharp, her faith sincere, but her body failed her more each day. During those 10 years, she repeatedly tried to reconnect with her church, its leadership, and her friends in the congregation. She invited them to visit her at home, but to no avail. Every invitation was either declined or simply ignored. Toward the end, when she was under palliative care at home, my grandmother decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandfather called the church and asked for the senior pastor, whom she had known for over 30 years, to visit her. They wanted the memorial service to be held at the church and planned to discuss it with him. But the senior pastor was too busy, and instead, the assistant stopped by a few days later. According to my grandfather, here's how that visit went, with my grandmother literally on her deathbed. The three of them, my grandmother, grandfather, and the assistant, talked about the funeral for a couple of minutes, but then the assistant started pressuring her, urging her to store up treasures in heaven and not forget her church and her will. My grandfather firmly told him, now is not the time or place to discuss her will. They briefly returned to discussing the funeral, but the assistant steered the conversation back to her will, generously adding talk about how much her church needed her support. My grandfather repeated several times that discussing her will and the church's financial needs with a dying woman was inappropriate, especially given she was in excruciating physical pain. The assistant seemed to agree and talked about the funeral again, but then inevitably returned to the topic of money, heavenly rewards, quoting, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Matthew 6:21, Luke 12:34, and so on. My grandmother broke down in tears. To be clear, my grandmother wasn't just a strong woman. She was a titanium figure coated in diamond and wrapped in Kevlar. She almost never cried, and certainly never cried for herself. Not a single tear when the doctor told her her spine was so broken she'd never walk again, nor during the 6 months of fruitless rehabilitation that followed. At funerals or hospital visits with relatives receiving bad news, she might shed sincere but restrained tears. She cried to comfort others. Weep with those who weep. But neither my grandfather, her daughter, my mom, my uncle, nor my grandmother's siblings could recall her ever crying for herself. My grandmother was sobbing uncontrollably. My grandfather, a former steelworker, retired Marine Corps sergeant, and Korean War veteran, grabbed the assistant and literally threw him out of their house. Not too gently. Against all expectations, my grandmother lived another 6 months purely on willpower. In the end, she passed, and we held the memorial service at a funeral home, not at Big White Church. The senior pastor and the assistant were conspicuously absent. Moreover, not a single clergy member from Big White Church was present. Not in the room, not on the stage, nowhere. At the start of the ceremony, my grandfather stepped up to the podium before the gathered crowd and said, "Some of you may have heard that I didn't invite the senior pastor or the assistant to this service. I believe now is not the time or place to explain my reasons. But you all know me and know I had good reasons. Besides, my wife herself asked me not to invite them. This memorial will be different from ones you may have attended. It will be an open mic memorial. Anyone who wants to can come up here, share about their friendship with my wife, recall a story worth remembering, or say something to honor her memory and bring comfort to everyone gathered here today. I've asked a few family members to prepare remarks, but it's not required. If you want to say something, Come up and speak. About 100 people attended the funeral. At least a third of them ended up speaking at the mic. The service, planned for half an hour, lasted over 2 hours, and as far as I know, no one left early. There was laughter, tears, and hugs. 3 grandchildren played her favorite songs on the piano and guitar. We all held hands and sang them together. After the ceremony, dozens of people told my grandfather it was one of the most touching and heartfelt funerals they'd ever attended. Many added, "Funerals without pastors are better," or something to that effect. A couple of weeks later, it was time to begin distributing my grandmother's estate according to her will. Though my grandmother and grandfather loved each other dearly, they had separate wills. As my grandmother explained to my mom, it made it easier to respect each other's boundaries. Their lawyer recommended it too. No one thought they had any great wealth. They lived over 50 years in the same small, cozy house in a nice suburb. They worked hard and lived modestly, but rumors suggested they had decent savings. Of course, there's no legal obligation to attend a will reading. It's become rare nowadays thanks to widespread literacy and communication tools. But in our family, will readings were a tradition. It was one of those rare occasions when our large, close-knit family gathered. We didn't have family reunions, too hard to organize with such a big family, but we gathered for birthdays, holidays, funerals, christenings. So, by attending a few such events, you'd see nearly all your cousins, uncles, aunts, great-uncles, great-aunts, and grandparents' siblings. Given this tradition, our family's wills often included very personal gifts with little monetary value, but served as a way to pass on a final warm memory or piece of the soul to loved ones. Plus, my grandfather hinted that my grandmother's will had surprises, and family gossip spread the rumors. The reading took place in a law firm's conference room. As expected, my mom, aunts, uncles, cousins, and many grandchildren were there. But what truly surprised us was the appearance of the senior pastor and the assistant from Big White Church. They said my grandmother's lawyer told them her will included not only a donation to the church, but also personal gifts for both of them. Maybe it was just our imagination, but to me, my siblings, and cousins, it was hard not to notice. Those two looked like they were salivating in anticipation of my grandmother's generosity. My grandmother had a large family, so the will named quite a few heirs. The conference room at the lawyer's office was slightly smaller than a typical middle-class living room. Extra chairs were brought in, every seat was taken, and the remaining space was filled with people standing. The room barely fit us all. My grandmother's lawyer suggested seating the senior pastor and the assistant next to him. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant the lawyer and both pastors sat facing everyone else. The pastors seemed flattered to be the center of attention but didn't notice, unlike us, that these seats allowed everyone to closely observe them. And getting to the door without interrupting the gathering was now nearly impossible for them. They sat farthest from the exit, with about 24 people between them and the door. The inheritance was generous but largely expected. My grandfather received their house, its contents, pension savings, and everything left after the other gifts were distributed. Children, grandchildren, and a few local charities received nice, though not exorbitant sums. Some sentimental items were given to friends and relatives. The will listed my grandfather first, then the other recipients in order of increasing gift value. First came keepsakes with little monetary value, then each grandchild received a few $1,000s. Then slightly more went to each son, daughter, brother, sister, nephew, and niece. Then substantial sums went to a few local charities, and so on. The donations to Big White Church, the senior pastor, and the assistant were near the very end of the list. They politely listened to everything before, but with growing impatience, especially as they noticed the increasing generosity of my grandmother's gifts with each line read. When the lawyer reached the part concerning Big White Church and the pastors, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I announce the bequeathed sums for Big White Church, the senior pastor and the assistant, Miss Grandmother's name, asked me to read the following letter to everyone present." He opened a letter written in my grandmother's hand. In the last 10 years, not a single person from Big White Church called me, visited me, or sent so much as a note to say they remembered me. Not one pastor, not one deacon, not one woman from the church, not one of the congregants I worked with for so many years, whom I sincerely loved and considered friends. I labored diligently for you for years when you needed me. But when I needed you in my church, you pretended I didn't exist. The only visit I received was when I was dying and invited the senior pastor to my home to help plan my funeral. It was my final attempt, after countless tries over the last 10 years, to reconnect with my church and the pastor I still deeply loved. Despite their clear message that they didn't love me, I hoped that if I could arrange a funeral at the church, maybe some of my old friends from the congregation whom I hadn't seen in a decade would come to say goodbye. I knew how much they loved hearing the senior pastor's sermons. If he spoke at my memorial, maybe they'd come, even if not for me. But the senior pastor didn't even have time to call and say whether he'd conduct the service. The assistant came by but didn't talk about the funeral. He only wanted me to remember his church in my will. That's it. Just remember the church in your will. And then I realized I had let my church break my heart for the last time. But that was the last time. The the very last. The assistant didn't know that when he came, my grandfather and I had already drawn up my will long before. And back then, it did include a double tithe, 20% of my entire estate, for the church that was once mine but was now my former church, Big White Church. That amount was, a sum was named, an absolutely staggering amount of money that elicited a hushed wow from many heirs, including me. But then I felt uneasy that we hadn't named such wonderful people as the senior pastor and the assistant by name, so I amended the will to include them by name. And while I was at it, I also changed the amount I bequeathed to Big White Church to match all the love they showed me in the last 10 years of my life, when I was suffering, lonely, and could no longer work for them for free as I had for nearly half a century. That's all she wrote, the lawyer said. Now, back to the distribution of the estate per the will. To the senior pastor, 1 cent. To the assistant, 1 cent. To Big White Church, 1 cent. The senior pastor and the assistant sat with faces as if both had just been injected with a gallon of Novocaine in their jaws. Every one of my grandmother's family and friends had an overwhelming urge to burst out laughing, but we held back because we knew my grandmother and we knew this wasn't the end. She was just setting the stage for the real blow. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss it. There's one more bequest, the lawyer continued, to a charitable organization. He named it, but I'll call it Black Charity. He paused before announcing the amount. Most of us had no idea what this organization was. But from the expressions on the senior pastors' and assistants' faces, it was clear they knew Black Charity very well. Their faces showed shock, horror, and panic, as if the lawyer had just said, "This donation is for demonic child eaters to buy giant grills and tons of charcoal for a barbecue." All eyes in the room turned to the pastors. The lawyer, who also happened to be my uncle, one of my grandmother and grandfather's sons, let that pause linger a few seconds longer. If we could read the senior pastors' and assistants' minds, we'd understand why they looked like that. Black Charity was a charitable organization tied to a large black church just a few miles from Big White Church. They provided free food and clothing distribution, foster care support, meal delivery for the elderly, legal aid, and other social programs. Many years ago, Big White Church, which was and still is 100% white, provided financial and other support to Black Charity for a few years. But then there was an extremely painful and messy fallout, supposedly because Black Charity practiced a social gospel, while Big White Church preached the true gospel. Big White Church even sued them, trying to recover some of the funds. The matter was settled, but bad blood remained. But since this was the southern U.S., everyone knew the real reason. Big White Church, like any white church, stopped supporting Black Charity. My grandmother and grandfather seriously considered leaving Big White Church back then, but decided it was better to stay and preach tolerance through words and personal example. They knew they couldn't change everyone's minds, but maybe they could reach the youth in their white church and break the multi-generational cycle of racism. My grandmother always told us, "My church is my mission field." We only understood the true meaning of those words after her death. Since then, my grandmother and grandfather had secretly donated part of their tithe to Black Charity every month. Most of our family, including me, only learned about this after the gathering ended. But the senior pastor and assistant undoubtedly understood exactly what my grandmother was trying to tell them. Not with words, but with actions that speak louder than any words. If you grew up in the South and were white, you'd understand too. The message was clear. These people you despise and oppress are better than you, and they are the ones who deserve my money, not you. After enough time had passed for everyone in the room to observe the expressions on the senior pastors and assistants' faces as they processed how they and their church had treated my grandmother, the lawyer said, "The amount is..." And then he announced the exact same enormous sum mentioned in my grandmother's letter, the one that would have gone to Big White Church had she not changed her will. That's the end of the story. Thanks for listening to it all the way through. Be sure to write in the comments what you think about it. And of course, check out our previous video, which you'll see right here. And good luck to you.